Guys, welcome back to another Android application development tutorial. Today we are going to create an Android application contain floating action buttons with some symbol animation. So here is our Android application. So here is a main floating action button. So if I click this floating action button, you can see another two floating action button appear. And if I again click the main floating action button, you can see the other two one disappear. So this is our Android application. And here you can see when these two small floating action button appear and disappear, there is some symbol animations. So when these two small floating action button appear, actually we scale it from 0 to 80% of its actual size. And at the same time we change the opacity from 0 to 1. So when you close it, the reverse thing happens. When you close it, we scale it from 80% to 0%, and at the same time we change the opacity of these two small floating action button from 1 to 0. So that's why it disappears. Okay, so that is the animations associated with these two small floating action button. And for the main floating action button, here you can see when you open these two small floating action button, the main floating action button rotate 45° clockwise. That's why this will change into an into mark. So for when you close it, here you can see the main floating action button rotate 45° anti-clockwise. So that is the animation associated with the main floating action button. So now we are going to create this Android application. Open Android Studio and start a new Android Studio project. Specify an application name. Now select an empty activity. Okay, now the project is created. The first thing you need to add the needed dependency for the application. So open Gradle file and add the needed dependency. So here floating action button is the part of design support library. So here you need to add the needed dependency. Change this one into design. Now make a project sync. Now we need to add some resources. We need to add some background icons. So here is our application. We need to add these background images, background icons. So here I have some background icons. So you need to add all these images in the form of an image asset. So go to Android Studio and add a new image asset. Change this one into action bar and tab icons. Specify an icon name. Now change asset type into image. Now select an image from your computer. Change theme into hollow dark. Now you need to add all the needed image in the form of image asset. So here I add all the needed images. Here I add 3 images. Now open values folder, go to colors.xml. Here we need to add some material color patterns. So here I add 2 material color patterns. These colors are used for the 2 floating action buttons. So for these 2 small floating action button, we are going to use the newly added color patterns, and for the bigger one we are going to use the color accent of our application. Now go to dimensions.xml. Here add a new dimension attribute. specify the attribute name as FAB margin right, and the value is 16 dp. Okay, now we need to add a directory for images. So add a new resource directory. Specify the directory name as anim. Now we can add the needed animation. So create a new animation resource file. Specify the file name as FAB open. So here you need to add two sets of animation. First one is for change the scale, and second one is for change the opacity of the object. So here I add the animation for change the scale of the object. So here the duration is 300 millisecond, and here we have to change it. We have to change the scale of the floating action button from 0 to 80%. So here from scale is 0 and to scale is 0.8. And here is the interpolator. Interpolator means the rate of change of animation. Here we use a linear interpolator. That means here the rate of change of animation is constant. And here is pivot X and pivot Y. The pivot X and pivot Y means it is the starting point or central point of animation. So here we use the value 50%. That means the animation is start from the middle of the object. Now we need to add the animation that change the opacity of the object. So here is the animation that change the opacity of the object. You have to use an alpha attribute, and here also the duration is 300 millisecond. Here we have to change the opacity from 0 to 1. So here from alpha is 0 and to alpha is 1. And here the interpolator is accelerate interpolator. Accelerate interpolator means here the animation starts slowly and it is accelerated towards the end. So this is the animation file used when you open the floating action buttons. And one more thing, here you need to add another thing, Android fill after into true. This is to make sure that the animation transformation occur only after complete the animation. So now we need to add another animation file. So right click the animation folder and create another animation resource file. Specify the file name as FAB close. Here the same thing, but all are in the reverse manner. First you have to specify fill after into true. First you have to, here all are same but in reverse order. So here is the scale animation, here duration 300, here we have to scale from 80%, that means 0.8, and we have to scale to 0%. And here the interpolator is linear interpolator, and here pivot X pivot Y is 50%. And here is the animation that changed opacity, duration 300 from alpha 1 and to alpha 0. That means after finishing this animation the object disappear. And here the interpolator is accelerate interpolator. Now we need to add another animation for rotate the main floating action button 45° clockwise. So here the file name is rotate clockwise. Here first the same thing, you have to specify the fill after into true. Now you need to add the animation that change the object 45° clockwise. So you have to use a rotate attribute. Here the duration 300, we have to rotate it from 0°, and we have to rotate to 45°. And here the interpolator is linear interpolator. that means animation is constant, and pivot X and pivot Y is 50%. Now we need to add another animation for rotate the main floating action button 45-degree anti-clockwise. So here the file name is rotate anti-clockwise. First specify the fill after into true. Now specify the animation for the anti-clockwise rotation. Here the reverse thing. Here duration 300, and from degree here we have to rotate it from 45 degree and we have to rotate to 0 degree. And interpolator is linear interpolator, pivot X and pivot Y is 50%. So now we complete all the needed animations. Now we can design our application. So go to activity main.xml. So first here I am going to change the root element into a coordinator layout. So instead of a relative layout, we need a coordinator layout. Okay, now here I am going to add the main floating action button. Open the preview window. So first here I am going to add the main floating action button. So add a floating action button. Specify with the smudge parent wrap content height into wrap content. So here the floating action button appear. Now we have to align this one at the bottom end. So we have to use the layout gravity attribute. So layout gravity, specify the layout gravity as bottom end. So now we align the floating action button at the bottom end. Now specify a layout margin at the right side. Okay, now we have to specify a margin at bottom. Android layout margin bottom into 16 dp. Now we need an image at the background. So use the src attribute from drawable, select an image. Here the image is plus icon. Now specify an elevation for this into 6 dp. Now specify an ID for this floating action button. I name it as FAB plus. Now here you have to add some additional XML namespace. So I copy this namespace and change the identifier into app, and here change that one into resource auto, res auto. So by using the newly created XML namespace, you have to add something called pressed translation z into 12 dp. Okay, so now the main floating action button is ready. Now we need to add another 2 floating action button at the top of the main one. So now here I am going to add the second floating action button. So I copy this entire floating action button and put it here. First change the ID into FAB. Change ID into FAB Twitter. Now you have to change the icon. Before I change the margin bottom into 100 dp. Okay, now here we have the second floating action button. Now change the icon, image, background image. Okay, so now the second floating action button is ready. Now we need to add the first one. One more thing, we have to change the background color. So use the background tint attribute, select a color from the colors.xml. Okay, now we can add the first floating action button. So I copy this one. Now this is the first floating action button. First change the ID of this button. Now change margin bottom into 180 dp. Now change the background color. Now we need to change the background image. Okay, now we finished the design of our application. So when it appear, we have to hide the two small floating action buttons. So here we have to change the visibility, Android visibility into invisible. Now we have to hide the second one, Android visibility into invisible. Okay, now the design is ready. Now we can start coding. Now go to main activity.java. So here first thing we have to declare some variables. We have to declare some variables for floating action buttons. We need 3 floating action buttons, FAB plus, FAB Twitter, and FAB FB. Now we need to initialize these variables. Find it. First type cast that one into floating action button. Now find it. Find the view by id r.id dot. First one is FAB plus. Now you need to initialize all these variables. So here I initialize all these variables. Now we have to create some variables for animations. So here we need 4 animation variables, FAB open, FAB close, FAB rotate clockwise, now FAB rotate anti-clockwise, now we need to initialize these variables. We have to initialize these animations. So FAB open equal to animation util dot load animation. First you have to specify the application context. Now specify the application XML file name. So r.anim dot, here the XML file name is FAB open. Now you need to initialize all these animations. So here I initialize all the 4 animations. Okay. Now here we need another variable. We need a boolean variable is open and initialized it with the value false. Now here we need to create an on-click listener for the main floating action button. So FAB plus dot set on-click listener. Now here we have to check some condition if the 2 small floating action buttons are already opened or not. So if is open, that means it is not open. So in the else case we have to open the small floating action buttons. So here we have to start the animation. So FB first floating action button dot start animation. Here the animation is FB open, FAB open. Now start the second floating action button, FAB Twitter, dot start animation, and here the animation is FAB open. Now we have to select this. We have to set animation for the main floating action button. So FAB plus dot start animation, FAB rotate clockwise, now we have to make sure that the two small floating action buttons are clickable. So FAB Twitter dot set clickable into true. Now the second floating action button into set clickable into true. Now we have to change the variable name is open into true. Okay, that's it. So if the floating actions buttons are already open, we have to close it. If user click the main floating action button again. So here change this one into FAB close. Here also change that one into FAB close. And here it is FAB rotate anti-clockwise. And we have to make sure that the two small floating actions buttons are no longer clickable, so make that one into false. And here change this variable value into false. Okay, now we finish the coding. Now we can test our application. So now run this application, select a virtual device. Okay, now the application available on this virtual device. So here is the main floating action button. So now here the small floating action button appear with some animation. I hope you understand the concepts. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.